In the interest of time, I think we should go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Francisco Moreno, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Grand Rounds, Psychiatry Grand Rounds. And today is my honor to introduce the speaker, Dr. Joel Duvoskin, and I'll briefly tell you a couple of things that will not do justice to all the great accomplishments that Dr. Duvoskin has in his pack. But I'll tell you that I have known him for a number of years since he was one of the instructors during my residency training as well. We enjoyed having him in our seminar, and I've seen Joel here and there at different places, a little socially, and it's a pleasure to know him as a person outside of the job setting as well. And Joel has a background in psychology. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with majors in English and psychology and with honors. He had also received a diploma from the University of Stockholm, and in 1972 with a major or a diploma in social sciences. Then he came over to Arizona, where he did his graduate training, getting a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's here at the U of A. And before that, he had some really interesting and meaningful experiences hanging out with the Peace Corps in Africa and helping coach folks up there for basketball, then coming over to the NIMH for a period of time, then coming over to Tucson, where he was doing externship at different locations here in our community, including the Catalina Mountain School, Palo Verde Hospital, and the Arizona Supreme Court. In addition to this trainings, Joel has become an expert in the area of forensics, and he's a diplomat in forensic psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology, fellow of the American Psychological Association, fellow of the American Psychology and the Law Society, and he's the recipient of a number of awards, has a large number of publications that include peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as books reviews, and a lengthy number of academic contributions and presentations. And his job includes doing a lot of forensic type evaluations and consultations to institutions and settings for safety and the proper treatment of the mentally ill. So today he's going to be talking to us about the clinical evaluation of institutional suicide risk assessment and documentation when removing a suicide watch. Please help me welcome Dr. Duvoskin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. Basically, what I'm going to talk about today, a different title for this is How Not to Lose a Lawsuit. As all of you know, when there's a death by suicide in any institutional setting, whether it's a psychiatric hospital or a jail or a prison, litigation also often follows. And I do quite a bit of expert testimony in wrongful death cases. And I can tell you that one of the easiest ways to lose such a lawsuit is when you've written a note that says, no SI, no HI, discontinue suicide watch. And because it shows no evidence that a suicide risk assessment was completed. And lawyers are frequently fond of saying if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And while that's technically wrong, it's not a bad way to proceed professionally that you should write down what you do. Now, if in fact a suicide risk assessment wasn't done, then the entity deserves to lose the lawsuit. But the sad thing is when a real good suicide risk assessment was done and it's not documented, and then there's a legal presumption that an adequate job wasn't done. So what I'm going to talk about today are some basic things that I wasn't taught in graduate school, and many psychiatrists tell me they weren't taught in residency. I hope that's not the case here, and I hope that some of this is redundant or reinforcing information that you already have. Okay. Now, the institutions I'm talking about are pretty much all institutions, and a high percentage of psychiatry is practiced under the auspice of various institutions, including prisons, jails, psychiatric hospitals of all kinds, state hospitals, acute community inpatient units, university or medical school-based inpatient units, sex offender treatment facilities, and juvenile justice facilities, both detention and residential facilities. Increasingly, psychiatrists are practicing in those places, and often without a real strong infrastructure that you might find in a hospital. So you might be working as a contractor in a small jail, part-time, but the requirements of adequate practice are going to be similar to those anytime anybody's being treated for potential suicidality. Now, a couple of things I want to say generally about suicide, and one of them is, in institutions, is to remind people to consider the possibility that your patients are doing the best that they can. This is a quote that Marsha Linehan made famous in her book on dialectical behavioral therapy, treating people with diagnoses of borderline personality disorder. But there's a lot of the bad work that I see in suicide risk assessment looks to be negative countertransference. When you read notes, it's pretty shocking sometimes to see the angry things that are written in progress notes about people, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. The thing that we are supposed to have the most of and often demonstrate the least of is empathy. It's useful to think when you're dealing with somebody who's made a threat or a gesture or some other parasuicidal behavior to consider what your judgment's like when everything has gone wrong for you. Most of the time that people are in institutions, whether they're children, adolescents, or adults, things have gone badly for them, and that's why they're there. Nobody gets sent to jail for singing too enthusiastically in church. People get sent to jail when they've done something wrong or they've been accused of something serious. They aren't able to get out quickly. They probably have few resources, and they may be disconnected from their families and friends. It's also important to understand that your patient's behavior isn't about you. And I find it's good to remind myself of that periodically, because there's almost like there's a myth that the patient woke up this morning and said, you know what would really ruin Joel's day is if I made another suicidal gesture, and that in fact they may be in a great deal of distress. And the most important general thing that I teach people is that despair has to be our enemy, and that the things we do to intervene should be despair fighters. And one of the strong points you're going to hear from me more than once today is that suicide precautions, suicide watches, any suicide preventive intervention must not be punitive. And we're not the best people to judge that. The punitiveness, or punitivity, if it were a word, is in the eye of the person experiencing it. And being locked in a stripped cell, as is often the case when people are suicidal, without anything to read or do, without anyone to talk to, is perceived by a lot of people as punitive and may make their despair worse. There is, of course, no such thing as a suicide-proof institution. So we use words like suicide-resistant. I often am asked by, as part of lawsuits, to go in and do an architectural assessment of suicide hazards in various hospitals. If you haven't had that done and you work in an institution, have it done by somebody that knows what they're doing. I walk around with a handkerchief and show people different ways that I could suspend my body weight from things that are relatively easy to attach to a ligature in a room. And if the person's got clothing and they're being watched every 15 minutes or every 10 minutes, it's pretty easy to make a ligature and affix it to something, including, by the way, breakaway hooks that don't break away. And we teach officers to test those every time they walk into a cell, is to test the breakaway hooks and make sure that they're moving as they're supposed to. But despite those efforts, it's not possible to guarantee that someone couldn't kill themselves in any space. But what you can do is change the odds so that it's not easy to die. And many suicides take place in rooms that retrospectively are a horror. And it's obvious, or should have been obvious to anybody who had thought about it, that this is an easy place to kill yourself. Now, when people are not on suicide watch, you want to make sure that you remove the obvious hazards and the easiest ways to hurt yourself. But there's no heightened duty to keep people from killing themselves when there's been no reason to put them on a suicide watch. But it's useful and important and a good idea to not make it easy to kill yourself if you become impulsively distressed and are unaware of another way to end your psychological pain. Once people are placed on a suicide watch, of course, there's a much heightened duty to suicide resist the living space that they're going to be housed in as much as possible, or constantly observe the person. Suicide is typically a crisis, so often in institutions, especially correctional institutions, suicide is associated with impulsivity, with angry impulsivity especially. The treatment of choice for angry impulsive suicide is to keep people alive over some period of time, typically until the sun comes up the next morning and some of their natural defenses kick in or supports emerge, like they get to talk to their lawyer, they get bailed out, they find out that their family isn't going to reject them, etc. I don't have time to go into this part in detail, but we have cut jail suicides all over the United States by about 2/3 by simply screening people and keeping them alive when they're known to be a serious risk of what we call front door suicides. These are impulsive suicides in the first 24 to 72 hours of incarceration. And thanks to people like Lindsay Hayes and Judy Cox and others, it is now the standard of care that any jail or prison or juvenile institution must screen for suicidality, which simply means asking people a few simple questions, the most important of which is, are you thinking about killing yourself? From there, if they say yes or give any positive response to the screen, you then arrange for them to be evaluated by a mental health professional and, if necessary, put on a watch. By these simple steps, 2/3 of all the suicides in jails have been prevented, and we know this because places that implement these see a significant drop in suicides, mostly of the front door variety. However, we've not been successful in decreasing that last third of the suicides. And those tend to look more like prison suicides. Prison suicides, as opposed to jail suicides, are marked by their lack of temporal predictability. They don't happen at the front door. They often happen when some other thing has come in, some other piece of information that the institution may or may not be aware of. Dear John letters, a bad result from a hearing or a court appearance, or a prolonged depression that wasn't brought to someone's attention. As I hope you've learned in your training, suicidal people are always ambivalent. And the reason I know this is because they're still alive. It's not that hard to kill yourself. And so when someone is suicidal but still alive, it means that there's a part of them that wants to live. But the fact that they're telling you want to die, you should believe them, because that's also true. So to be simplistic about it, it's like there's an angel in one ear and a devil in the other ear telling the person, die, 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 or live, live, live. And when they're letting you know about this, it's because they want you to help the angel win the argument. So this ambivalence often misleads institutions into believing that people are lying when they say they're suicidal, or my least favorite word in institutions, manipulating. And I'll talk about that in a bit. It's real ambivalence, and they want your help. They want you to help them stay alive. Suicidologists also teach that suicide is typically done by a person who perceives no other ways to end their psychological pain. So people who are creative thinkers have other options typically that come to mind, while people who are more rigid thinkers, or whose thinking has become rigid because of their mental status, are more likely to see no other option to end their psychological pain other than suicide. Some myths and misconceptions, of course. If someone talks about committing suicide, they really don't mean it. I don't have to spend time on this one. You all know that that's a very dangerous myth. In fact, the majority of people who kill themselves have talked about it first. Asking about suicide might give someone the idea. You would think that this myth, which pretty much got destroyed 30 years ago, would be doing no mischief now. There are still cases where people weren't asked about suicide for this stated reason. Well, I didn't want to give them the idea. He was really down, but today's in a great mood. Everything must be okay now. This is something that you all well know, that sometimes when people are starting to come out of a depression, they're more energized, they're still dissatisfied and distressed. Anxiety might increase when depression wanes. If you think about it, there's not much to be afraid of when you're depressed. Today was bad, tomorrow was going to be bad. There's not much uncertainty when you're depressed. When the depression starts to lift, anxiety can increase and distress can increase. And of course, it's a time for caution. And finally, the dangers of a contract for safety. If you or the staff you work with, if you ever see a note that says the words contracted for safety or words like that, you have an institutional problem. As I'll tell you in a bit, the person's stated intentions regarding suicide are relevant pieces of data, but they are not dispositive. And people often will tell you, and they might not be lying, that they'll stay alive till Monday when you come back to work. And you're betting their life that no intervening variable is going to overcome that promise. A phone call from their wife saying you'll never see me or your kids again, and may overcome given their word to you, who's relatively unimportant in their life. So there's not one, I'm unaware, there's a study that I'm told that I haven't seen yet that just came out that did a meta-analysis of contract for safety. Unless that contradicts me, I was unable to find one single study. I did a thorough literature search. I was unable to find one study that validates the concept of contract for safety. What are the key components of an institutional suicide prevention program? Well, first of all, the institution should have a plan. And even if you're just a contractor who works a few hours, if your institution is missing any of these elements, you're being put in harm's way, and your patients are being put in harm's way, and it's worthwhile for you to bring this to the attention of the facility administrators. There should be a suicide plan, and it should be in writing. And whatever's written should be followed up so that it's actually done. Secondly, I strongly recommend the establishment of a suicide prevention committee whose job as a group is to come together and think like people who want to kill themselves, looking for hazards, looking for persistent patterns of suicidal or parasuicidal behavior in your institution, and then documenting those and following up on them so that you act on them the same way you would act upon clinical dangers, like if we notice that we have twice as many medication errors on weekends on a particular shift and don't do anything about it, and somebody dies from a medication error, we're going to be held negligent. Training, training, and more training for all of the staff. This includes food service staff. The people who deliver meals to people may be the first person to notice a depression because somebody turns down their dinner or gives it back uneaten several times in a row. All staff should know what to look for and how to report suicidality. Supervision, because training without supervision does not change behavior, period. Many of you, if you've worked in institutions, are familiar with sergeants saying, I don't care what you learned in the academy, let me tell you how we do it on my shift. So if the supervision doesn't reinforce what people are trained to do, it won't change their behavior. Screening, which I already mentioned, which is simply asking people some very simple questions that are well documented in the literature to identify especially acute risk factors for suicide. For those people who screen positive, they should receive a mental health assessment from a qualified mental health professional. And that's typically 20, 30 minutes, a brief intervention to make a decision about whether or not they need to be on a watch and whether or not they need more intensive treatment. Communication between various parts of the organization. This is especially important if you're a part-time contractor coming in, and you may not be aware of all the information that the institution has about your patient, but in retrospect, if there's a bad outcome, you're going to be held accountable for why you didn't ask for it. Facility-wide staff involvement, including every piece of the facility. I can't think of anybody who shouldn't be included in suicide risk assessment. Post-incident peer review and mortality and morbidity conferences, not only for deaths, but also for serious attempts. And the Suicide Prevention Committee that I talked about before should review that data and follow up on recommendations for changes in policy and practice. Let me stop for 1 second and any questions so far or comments? Amy?
I wanted to ask about contracts for safety. You know, part of my job is evaluating patients in the ER, and I know that contracts for safety are not valid, but the problem is for us to send them to like a level 2 step-down unit, they often want that documented and know for us to send them there.
Amy's question was, in working in emergency departments, that to send somebody to a level 2 facility, and I didn't understand the last part, that they want you to...
So in order to get a patient from our ER to a step-down crisis center, they want in our assessment that the patient contracts for safety in order to take them at their facility.
Well, what I would recommend you do is offer to do suicide prevention training for them, because they're laboring under the same misconception that the mental health professions, frankly, did for a long time. That means something, and that you know, they're hanging their hat on a breakaway peg too. That simply a contract for safety, as opposed to a thorough suicide risk assessment, which is much more valid and reliable. You know, I would probably, if it were me, I think I'd probably talk to whoever was in charge of that level 2 facility and try to give them some good information about suicide risk prevention. Hopefully, if you like this hour, I think it's going to be on the website. You can ask them to watch it. but that's a dangerous practice. You know, I would take your clinical judgment after a suicide risk assessment over a contract for safety 100 times in a row. Did I answer your question? Any other questions or comments? Okay. In assessing the level of risk, we typically often start with admitted suicidal intent or an observation of a behavior that looks suicidal. We want to know whether the person has a detailed plan, and that's part of the normal way that we historically have looked at it. And we want to know whether they have the means to carry out the plan, and especially paying attention to the lethality of the means that are available. Sadly, I've come to the conclusion now, when I do risk assessments, I pretty much assume that everybody has a firearm. And I'm sorry to say that, but there's an estimated 270 million firearms in the United States, and there's only about 330 million people. And this is Arizona, where guns are easily available. So my assumption is that people either have a firearm or could get one easily if they wanted one. So that means suicide risk assessment here, the heat's turned up a little bit, but I also make the same assumption in other states. Even where it's illegal to possess firearms, it's not that hard to get one. So the lethality of means is a little harder to assess than it used to be, but it's still worth asking about. Does the person have a gun? Is that what they've been thinking about? Is that part of their plan? How would they do it? Feelings of peace and resolution. I actually can't remember a suicide where someone gave their belongings away, but it's not hurtful to list that as a danger factor. It's been in the clinical lore for decades and decades. Goodbye letters, unfortunately, we often find them in unlikely places, so it's not always obvious that a letter's been written. But if one's found and the person's still alive, I would say they would be at the highest level of risk. A history of suicide attempts, both performed by the person and observed by the person. One of the reasons that having a suicide in the family is of interest to us, one is because of genetics, because of the likelihood of a mood disorder, but also because of modeling. If the person has observed suicide and believes that it ended someone's pain, they're more likely to view it as a way to end their own pain. Of course, I'm going through this quick because I think you know a lot of this stuff, so if there's something you want me to dwell on, please feel free to stop me. Obviously, depressive disorders have the highest correlation to suicide, but anger is also related to suicide. Fear can be related to suicide. Isolation, cognitive, well, what those have in common is they're distress-inducing emotions. Cognitive rigidity, because of what I said before, that it decreases the person's ability to come up with other non-suicidal solutions to their psychological pain. Hopelessness, which is, of course, strongly related to depression. Suicidal ideation and threats. And a history of impulsivity, especially angry impulsivity, as opposed to hedonistic impulsivity. Substance abuse is related to suicide in institutions for a bunch of reasons. One is if the person is intoxicated when they come in, their judgment's impaired. Two, as the intoxication starts to wear off with alcohol, depression can ensue or be pushed in that direction. Three is to the extent that they're habituated or addicted, withdrawal can be incredibly distressing, and that can be another reason that people choose suicide, because the distress exceeds their ability to deal with it. Now, the history of suicide attempts, first of all, you want to look at how recent the attempts were, how serious the attempts were. Those are commonly asked. The one that's less commonly asked is, was it under similar circumstances? One of the important things I want to know when someone comes into a jail is, when you were in jail before, were you ever on a suicide watch? Should you have been on a suicide watch? Did you think about killing yourself when you're in jail and you didn't tell anybody? Same thing with other kinds of institutions, juvenile justice settings, psychiatric hospitals. The last time my wife told me she was going to take the kids and I'd never see them again, I tried to kill myself, and my wife just told me she's going to take the kids and I'm never going to see them again. That's an anamnestic way of assessing risk that makes a good deal of sense. And note that the community stressors that lead to arrest, incarceration, or a hospitalization often are the same kinds of stressors that lead to suicide. Now, in addition to these clinical ones, there's behavioral markers and warning signs, expressions of hopelessness, expressions of helplessness and powerlessness, isolation, which correlates highly, a sense of disconnectedness and a lack of social supports. Basically, any negative change in demeanor, and in some cases, a positive change in demeanor that makes no sense. If suddenly looks carefree, and this is all stuff you know. Our enemy, as I said before, is despair, expressions of despair, which is sort of like hopelessness on steroids. And when people talk about despair and use extreme language to express their despair, it often signals that they don't know any other way to stop their pain. Whoops. Changes in hygiene, any expressions of extreme sadness, and talking about death, not even if they don't say they're going to kill themselves, they talk a lot about death. Crying spells, restlessness, lethargy, fatigue, extreme changes in either direction of appetite, and these are all things that you know from your training. Okay. Now, this is the part I really wanted to share with you. What should be, when someone's on a suicide watch, meaning somebody has decided that this person poses a heightened and imminent risk of suicide, such that they're going to spend money, extra staff on watching the person, maybe pull them out of the treatment environment. It's an expensive thing to do from a lot of perspectives. So when somebody else does that, or you did it, you now have a heightened duty to make sure that before you DC that suicide watch, that you've done an adequate risk assessment for suicide. And I'm going to go through each of these. Current mood, their current cognitions about suicide, their known nomothetic risk factors that apply generally, as well as idiographic risk factors that apply to them individually. Known protective factors, stated intentions about suicide, which is the one that's your contract for safety. What has changed since somebody thought they were in acute and imminent risk of suicide? Evidence or absence of futuristic thinking, and evidence of connectedness or disconnectedness. So let's take these one at a time. Of course, depression is the strongest correlation to suicide. Actually, I want to say one other thing about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, in many studies, correlates to high rates of suicide. It used to be 10%. The more recent data says about 5% of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia will eventually end their life at their own hand. What I'm about to tell you is just my opinion. I can't defend this with scientific proof, but I believe it to be true. I believe that in many of those cases, it's not schizophrenia that's leading to the suicide. It's our inability to see depression in people that have been labeled schizophrenic. So that when someone has a blank look on their face and they're labeled schizophrenic, it's very likely to be called flat affect, when the same face with somebody who's been labeled depressed can be called depressed affect. It's really depressing to be labeled schizophrenic in this society. And to the extent that your symptoms are not controlled, It's depressing to live in this world carrying it around and to deal with us. I was taught in graduate school not that long ago, and people are still being taught, that schizophrenia is a progressive, fatal, debilitating disease that ends in death. And that, of course, is completely wrong. Courtney Harding demonstrated with her research that that's only true of all the people who have this life sentence of progressive schizophrenia unto death. More than 2/3 of them recover, half with medication and half without. So just something I always try to include in these talks is if just because somebody's labeled suicide, please don't neglect the importance of looking for depression and treating it. Our friend is hope and our enemy is despair. So the more acute their distress, the more likely it is that suicide's going to cause them to kill themselves as a way to end their psychological pain. Most of the time, people ask about mood if they do any kind of assessment at all. Mood is the most likely thing to get mentioned in a note. But believe me when I tell you, I see notes from otherwise apparently good psychiatrists and psychologists that say, no SI, no HI, discontinue suicide watch. And I've yet to see him win a lawsuit with one of those notes. Next is cognitions about suicide. What do you think would happen if you killed yourself? And the person says, I would be burning forever in the fires of hell. That's why I haven't done it. That's good for you to know. If the person says, oh, it would end my pain, I would be at peace for the first time in a long time, that's obviously a higher risk answer. What are their ideas? Their religious ideas, their spiritual ideas. The answer to these questions can also lead you in directions for treatment. And I'll ask all of you, do a little homework. The next case you look at that has religious delusions or religious concerns in their depression, whether or not the chaplain has been included as a member of the treatment team. My prediction is the answer will be no. Do they have a belief that their pain will end? Does the person see any other way to end his or her psychological pain? How rigid is their thinking? Any comments about these first two? I got to remember to give you that chance. Okay. Nomothetic or general risk factors. Diagnosis of depression, a close family member or friend who has committed suicide, especially recently, for the reasons I said earlier. Recent suicide or serious attempt in this institution, and in light of the recent shootings in Tucson, everybody's antenna should be up because it's like the heat's been turned up on a whole community. You see this in institutions all the time where periods just after vivid violent events raise the risk of violent events in the institution. And I think to some extent that affects whole nations and certainly whole communities. Hopelessness, helplessness, and demographic factors. Age. By the way, those demographic factors may not be the same in your institution as they are in the community because there's different stressors. And demographic factors are changing right before our eyes. It used to be that African American men were at very low risk of suicide. African American teenagers, I think, have the highest increase in suicide risk in recent years. Idiosyncratic risk factors. What was going on, and I apologize, this is kids because I took some of this from a presentation I did for a juvenile justice institution. What was going on in the person's head the last time he or she was suicidal? What was going on around them the last time they were suicidal? So you want, all behavior, including suicide, is an interaction between a person and their situation. So you want to do an anamnestic assessment. What was going on in the person's thinking and cognitions at the time and what was going on around them at the time. To the extent that these are being repeated, the risk is higher. What happened prior to the last attempt and what happened after the last attempt? Did the person lose a particularly important person or even a pet recently? Dream killers. I did an assessment along with Steve Pitt and Park Dietz and Aaron Spires and Ron Walker. We did an assessment, post-mortem assessment of the Columbine shooters for the district attorney in Jefferson County, Colorado. And just before deciding to do this, Eric Harris was informed by the Marine Corps that he wouldn't be accepted as a Marine. And it was his dream. For a long time, he had been talking about his dream of becoming a demolitions expert in the Marines. Dream killers are a particularly distressing and despairing stimulus. So be aware of those and ask about them. The person may also have protective factors. What I hate about psychology is that we, and psychiatry is just as bad, we are incredibly well trained in telling people what's wrong with them. What's right with them, not so much. And when it comes to suicide prevention, protective factors are more informative than risk factors. One of the questions I always ask people when I'm doing a suicide risk assessment is, why are you alive? Tell me why you're here talking to me. You've described so much pain, and yet here you stand to tell the tale. How have you managed to stay alive? And it helps them, A, to see themselves as resilient. It also informs you about protective factors that can be buttressed. When somebody's life is horrible, it's not that easy to remove risk factors. So if somebody, I say, why are you still alive? And they say, well, I couldn't do it to my kids. And they say, well, and then I say, well, but now you say you are going to do it. What's changed? Well, I just got a letter from my, they say something bad about their ex-wife, and she said, I'm never going to see the kids again. And that allows me to say, how reliable has she been in the past? Does she always tell the truth? Does she ever change her mind about things? He said, yeah. And to think that perhaps this isn't a life sentence to never see his kids again, knowing that his kids are the best reason for him to stay alive. In one case, a sergeant was thoughtful enough to go get pictures of the guy's kids and made a color photo of them down at Kinko's and brought him into the guy and let him and gave it to him so that he could remind himself why it was important for him to stay alive. Typically, the pictures were in his property when he was in the suicide watch. How have you managed to survive with all this pain also gives you a chance to compliment the person on their strength, their resilience, and to help them see good things in themselves, which is hard to do when people are suicidal. Strengths like resiliency, creativity, and problem solving. And in my opinion, it's easier to buttress and support a strength than it is to eliminate a weakness or a risk factor. Next is the person's stated intentions regarding suicide. There is no such thing as a contract to safety, although it is a useful and important piece of data that ought to be factored into your assessment. Typically, if the person says they're going to kill themselves, you should believe them. Or you should behave as if you believe them, because the consequences of a false negative mistake are vastly more serious than the consequences of a false positive mistake. So believe the person who says, I will kill myself. Do not believe the people who promise to stay alive without some other evidence that the risk is reduced from the rest of your assessment. I don't know what impulsivity is, but I assume it's a typo, so sorry about that. They mean it when they, I apologize, this one got cut off. They mean it when they say, I'm going to kill myself. That's the assumption you should make. And as Dr. House teaches us every Tuesday night or whenever it's on, people lie sometimes. And that's why you don't believe a contract for safety. And people also tell the truth and then change their mind when there's intervening events. What has changed since, and it could be you tried to commit suicide, you told somebody you were going to commit suicide, or another mental health professional thought you were enough of a risk to put you on a suicide watch. What has changed? Look for changes in both risk factors and protective factors. Look for changes in their thinking and feeling, as well as changes in their environment. Did you get any letters? Have you talked to anybody on the phone? Punishment does not cure the wish to die, but it can make it stronger. Look at your own procedures for suicide intervention, suicide prevention, suicide watches, and ask yourself if you would experience it as punishment. I was in a juvenile justice system some months ago, and a psychologist, a doctoral level psychologist, begged me to let them use the yellow room. I'm a consultant there, and they pretty much try to do what I recommend most of the time. And I said, why do you want them to use the yellow room? Well, the yellow room is a place where there's nothing in the room, you're stripped, you're put in there with no clothes, and no books, no TV, nothing to do, no one to talk to. And I said, why do you want me to get them to reopen the yellow room? She said, because we've had a rash of kids lying about being suicidal now that we don't use the yellow room because it's not punitive enough to be on suicide watch. I said to this person, well, are you at all, so your theory is that if it's punitive, fewer people will make false claims of suicidality? She said, yeah. Happy that I had finally understood. I said, well, are you at all concerned that people who are really suicidal will be less likely to tell you that they're suicidal? And she went, oh. Now, that would be a funny story if it were rare. But most of the places that I go, suicide watch looks punitive to me and feels punitive to them. And so ask yourself questions like, why can't the person be in the day room if they're on one-to-one? If in fact they're on constant observation one-to-one, why do they need to be in a locked room if that's your practice? I can't think of an answer to that, and you're welcome to give me one if anybody can. Why can't you have a book? Well, the answer I got to that one was, well, they could cut themselves with the staple. Now, that would be the first person I've ever heard of that died from a staple wound. But they have a Bible. They're allowed a Bible, but because I guess Bible staples don't cut you. It's amazing how little thought goes into what it must be like to be there. So we need to use our empathy and try to make sure that the people who need treatment the most don't get the least of it at that time. And if suicide interventions are punitive, it reinforces the notion that not even the people who are here to help me can help me. If even they want to punish me and hate me, then it reinforces the person's lack of belief in their value and can increase the likelihood of a suicide. The decision process typically starts with a building of distressors, leading to feelings of hopelessness. They think of self-harm as a possible solution, typically among others, and they don't decide to do it. As other solutions fail, the desire to escape from their psychological pain doesn't. It's typically marked by ambivalence and eventually a decision to act, that that's the only solution to their psychological pain. It may involve planning or it may be impulsive. Looking for evidence of futuristic thinking, it's not a guarantee if they're thinking about the future. And I remind you that Dylan Klebold was here in Tucson picking out his dormitory room 2 weeks before the Columbine shootings. So futuristic thinking is not a guarantee, but it's an important variable. And the more people think futuristically, the less likely it is that they're planning to kill themselves. Are their plans for the future realistic? Do they have an internal or an external locus of control? A lot of people in institutions have a reasonable belief that life is happening to them, as opposed to them making decisions. We use a lot of language that reinforces that. For example, doctors write orders. People are assessed for their compliance with medication. And always remembering and encouraging the staff, your staff and the staff you work with, to remember the importance of hope and to look for every opportunity that they can to buttress hope. Does the person have a plan to die and a contingency plan? People are creative, and if they really want to die, they can come up with some pretty creative ways to do it. Luckily, when they're ambivalent, asking about them will often help them to reveal it to us. And above all, we shouldn't do things to make it worse, even if our intentions are good. And I've already given you one big example of that, which is punitive suicide watches. Tough love. Sometimes your nursing staff or your correctional staff, depending on the kind of institution, will recognize that, you know, this person's been crying wolf and we need to call their bluff. And if you're right, that's a good idea, but you have no idea whether you're going to be right or not. And it might be a lethal mistake that you make. And in my experience, it's often the unwitting expression of negative, angry countertransference of people that have inconvenienced us by their frequent suicidal or parasuicidal behavior. Punishment, as I said before, does not cure depression and it doesn't cure suicidality. The installation of hope does. What you say matters, and that's true of every single staff person who talks to people. It's especially true of psychiatrists and psychologists who are in positions of status and authority in institutions. I tell people, as a little exercise, I ask them how many of them have children and how many of them think their children don't listen to them. And everybody raises their hand that has a kid. And I go, I can prove to you that your kids listen to you without leaving this room. And they all go, how are you going to prove that? And I go, I want you to go home tomorrow and make them a promise. Wait 6 weeks and then don't keep it. And your kid will verbatim tell you what you said 6 weeks earlier. Is that not true? And they go, you got us. That's exactly right. Well, it's the same thing with patients. It's the same thing with clients. It's the same thing with inmates, with youth that are held in institutions. They really do listen to you, and every word you say really does matter. If you express hope, you're giving the person a gift that's probably worth more than all of psychiatry and psychology put together, if you can just share hope with people. Manipulation and gestures. First of all, how in the world can a resident of an institution manipulate you or the warden or the captain when we control every single contingency in the institution? They say, well, he's doing it for attention. And I say, well, you're running a heck of a place when the best way to get attention is by trying to kill yourself. Why don't you give people more attention for not trying to kill themselves? And maybe they'll do that, if that's really their goal. I actually think that's a self-serving explanation for parasuicidality. In fact, as I said to one of my unit chiefs one time, who was bound and determined to make his point that this was manipulation, that a person had purposely manipulated his way into a 5x8 strip cell for attention. And I said, Michael, nobody in the whole world shares your high opinion of the value of your attention. Anyway. Now, when we manipulate, we have a name for it. It's called social skills. When people who are powerless do it, we call it manipulation and insult them for it. And by the way, if they were better at manipulating, they would have more solutions to their psychological pain, and they probably wouldn't be killing themselves. Staff issues I want to attend to is start with your own countertransference and then look around you for the people in the manner in which people are reporting this. And sometimes it's useful to say to people, have you considered the possibility that this poor person is doing the best they can and they're just not very good at life right now? And maybe we can help them. Suicide has been described as the last great act of defiance, and that's one thing I think where this sort of manipulation idea is relevant, but it's really more of a condemnation of us than it is of them. When you take away all autonomy from a person, that may mean a great deal to them. And suicide is one way to assert autonomy. You can do a lot of things to me, you can take away a lot of things, but you can't make me live. And I think I have seen suicides where that was a primary motivation. Documentation is critical to effective care so that if somebody else sees the person afterwards, they need to know about the suicide, both what led up to it and what led you to take the person off of suicide watch. You want to make sure that you encourage the staff who refer people to you to document exactly, preferably word for word, what did you hear or say that led you to consider that the person may be suicidal. Clearly explain what you did and why, what was happening, how you elected to proceed, why you made the decision you made regarding to not put the person on a suicide watch or to put them on a watch. And this is the one that you never see, but I strongly commend it to you. Take an extra second and write a sentence about why you did not do what you did not do and why. I considered civil commitment and decided against it because, in my opinion, and based upon my risk assessment, Mr. So-and-so did not meet the criteria for civil commitment. Now, if you want to, you can make a form that has those 10 questions, mood, cognitions, risk factors, protective factors, and fill it out as you're doing the risk assessment and put it in the chart. If you have electronic charts in your institution, it's real easy to do that. You can keep it in your top desk drawer and document that you always ask those questions and put a note that says, conducted suicide risk assessment, parentheses, C form X, and determine the following things that were relevant, so that it's a shorter note. You don't have to write the answer to every question if there wasn't any relevant information. But it's hard for me to look at that list I gave you. Is there anything on there that you would say is unlikely to be relevant? Their mood, their cognitions about suicide, their stated intentions? Which of those shouldn't be documented in a note? The purpose of a note is to document things that are important, and if you don't put them in your note, aren't you really saying, or isn't a cross-examiner going to make it sound like you were saying that you didn't think it was important? Quickly, quality improvement. There is no better protection against lawsuit than a competent second opinion, whether it's by telephone or in person. Utilization review, look for outliers. We learned some really interesting things by looking at suicide attempts in some of our institutions. In one case, we found out that they happened when one staff member was on duty, and we then looked into that staff member and found out information that led to a termination. He was a bad man, and we didn't realize it. And what brought it to our attention was whenever he was working, distress went up. Mortality and morbidity reviews. Some attorneys, I don't know what law school they went to, say you shouldn't document those things. I've never met an attorney that I respected who said that. Because if you don't document it, you can't say that you did the things that came out of the M&M And the whole purpose of the M&M is to lead you to look for changes in policy and practice that will prevent recurrences, and you won't be able to demonstrate that you did that, which will make you look more negligent, less diligent. The goal, of course, is to never make the same tragic mistake twice, even if you got lucky. Interdisciplinary communication, I must say this psychiatry department especially is, I have found to be wonderfully interdisciplinary and respectful. That's why I love coming over here. So, but your institutions may not be. There may be individuals who aren't doing that. Keep an eye out for that. When staff, does somebody circle back to a staff member and say, hey, that referral you made was really helpful. I can't tell you the details, but I just want you to know it helped me a lot, and I'm on the case. Just that little bit of respect to somebody, to let them know they might have saved a life by observing something, will increase that behavior in the future. Remember, despair is our enemy, and in the fight to keep people from dying, hope is always our greatest gift and our most ferocious weapon. And of all the gifts you'll ever give to your patients, the greatest gift of all is hope. Thanks for the work you do, for your time and attention. I really appreciate coming here today. Thank you. And if you have any questions, fire away.